The Duke of Ashcombe had called her mother's land a debt to be collected, and he had said so within her hearing before he had ever learned her name. It was a raw morning in late October, the fields beyond Marlow Fen still silvered with frost that had not yet surrendered to the pale sun, and Eleanor Vane stood just inside the doorway of the estate office with a ledger pressed to her chest like armour, listening to a man she had never met describe her family's home as though it were a parcel of meat already weighed and priced. "The Fenland reverts to the estate at quarter day," he was saying to his steward, his voice carrying the flat, unhurried certainty of a man who had never once been told no and lived to regret it. "The Vane woman has no claim beyond sentiment, and sentiment does not answer a mortgage. Sell it, and be done with the business." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. There was a particular cruelty in how little the matter seemed to cost him, how easily her mother's 40 years of labour folded into a single administrative sentence, and Eleanor felt something in her chest go very still and very cold, the way a pond stills before it freezes entirely through. She did not announce herself. She only stepped back into the frost-white morning, closed the door with a care that made no sound at all, and began, in the small, orderly chambers of her mind, to plan. She had, after all, spent 3 years learning exactly how estates like his were bled dry by their own inattention, and she had spent the better part of a decade learning exactly how to make a failing tenancy answer for itself. The Duke did not know it yet, but the land he intended to sell out from beneath her mother's memory already belonged in every way that would soon matter. To her, she had not always intended to return to Marlow Fen. She had left it at 19 with her mother's blessing and a small inheritance from an aunt who had believed, rightly, that a clever girl wasted in a dwindling market town was a clever girl wasted altogether, and she had spent the years since apprenticed to a firm of land agents in the north. Then finally, proud to discover that Miss Vane could read a rent roll the way other women read novels, hunting out the small dishonesties hidden in its columns with an instinct that seemed almost unfair. She had drainage schemes and tenancy law, and the arithmetic of failing harvests folded neatly into her the way other women carried needlework, and when the letter came from her mother's solicitor, informing her with careful blandness that the Fenland was mortgaged past its worth, and that the Duke of Ashcombe held the paper, she had not wept. She had bought a train ticket. She had, in the 11 months since, done a great many quiet things that no one at Ashcombe House had thought to notice, because no one at Ashcombe House had thought a woman travelling alone with a battered satchel of documents worth noticing at all. And that oversight, he privately thought, was the most valuable inheritance the old Duke's cruelty had ever handed her. She had found the mortgage broker in Bath who held the actual note behind the Duke's claim, a nervous, honest little man who was only too glad to be paid in full by someone patient enough to listen to his complaints about the estate's tardy interest. She had paid him, quietly, entirely, and with papers drawn so carefully that not even the Duke's own solicitor, when the time came, would find a seam to pick at. The land was hers. She simply had not yet told the man standing in the frost-cold office that he no longer had anything at all to sell. The pretext, when it came, was mundane, which was precisely as it should be, for nothing in her experience of the world had ever begun with romance and ended in anything but disappointment. The drainage ditch that ran along the boundary between the home farm and the fen parcel had silted badly over the summer, and the estate steward, a weary, decent man named Higgins, who had inherited the Duke's temper without any of his money, appeared at her mother's cottage door within the week to inform her, with visible discomfort, that his Grace required the boundary cleared before the land changed hands, as a courtesy to whichever buyer might take it on. Eleanor listened to this with her hands folded and her expression perfectly composed, and said only that she would attend to it herself, as the ditch in question ran along ground that was, in point of fact, no longer the estate's to direct. Higgins blinked at her. "I beg your pardon, Miss Vane." "I'll show you the deed if you like," she said, and did not smile, because there was no pleasure yet in it, only the cold satisfaction of a column finally balancing. Higgins did not know what to do with the paper she produced, folded and creased, from months of careful keeping, and so he did what steadier men had always done when confronted with something outside the ordinary run of estate business. He carried the difficulty upward to the one person whose temper he feared more than his own confusion. And within 2 days, Eleanor Vane received a note, stiff with formality, requesting her presence at Ashcombe House to discuss what the letter called, with a coldness she found almost admirable in its precision, an irregularity in the estate's records. She went. She did not have to go, not really, for the deed spoke for itself and needed no defence from her in person, but she found, walking up the long gravel drive with the bare elms overhead creaking in a wind that smelled of the coming winter, that she wanted very much to see his face when he understood what had happened. She was shown into a library that was cold in the particular way that money makes rooms cold, all polished surfaces and no fire lit before noon, and the Duke of Ashcombe rose from behind a desk of a size clearly meant to make visitors feel their own smallness. He was younger than she had pictured, though she could not afterwards say what she had pictured exactly, for the voice she had overheard in the estate office had suggested to her a man made entirely of columns and figures, grey at the temples with disuse of feeling, and instead broad through the shoulder in the manner of someone who rode his own land rather than merely owning it, with a face that might have been called handsome if it had not been so thoroughly arranged into an expression of practice remove. "Miss Vane," he said, and there was no warmth in it, only the correct temperature of an introduction ode. "Higgins tells me there is some confusion regarding the Fen parcel." "There is no confusion at all, Your Grace," she said, and set the folded deed upon the desk between them with a care that was almost gentle, as though she were laying down a winning hand she took no joy in playing. "The land was mortgaged to a broker in Bath. I purchased the note in full this past spring. The parcel has not belonged to the estate in any legal sense for some months." She watched him read it. She had imagined this moment more times than she cared to admit in the cramped train carriages and colder solicitors' offices of the last year, and she had imagined satisfaction, imagined something almost like triumph, and instead what she found, watching the colour rise slowly along his jaw as he understood the extent of his own oversight, was something closer to pity, because a man who has never once had to check his own certainty against the facts is a man who has never learned how much it costs to be wrong, and she saw, in the brief, unguarded moment before he mastered his face again, that this was going to cost him rather more than the land. "You might have said so," he said finally, and his voice had gone very quiet, which she would learn in the months that followed was a far more dangerous register in him than volume ever was. "Before I instructed my steward to clear a boundary on land I no longer own. I might have," she agreed. "I confess I found some satisfaction in not doing so." It was perhaps an ungenerous thing to admit, and she saw it land on him with more weight than she had intended. Not offence exactly, but something more like recognition, as though he had heard in her plain sentence an echo of his own habitual bluntness turned back against him for the first time in longer than he could easily recall. "Then we understand one another," he said, and there was the ghost of something in it that was almost, though not quite, respect. I had thought from Higgins's account that I was dealing with some clerical confusion in Bath. I did not expect to find the confusion sitting across my own desk with the paperwork already perfected. "I find confusion rarely survives contact with a proper ledger," she said, and for the first time in the interview something flickered at the corner of his mouth that might, in a more generous man, have been the beginning of a smile, though he extinguished it before it could properly form. The way a man puts out a candle, he has no business lighting in a room he does not intend to stay in. She left Ashcombe House that afternoon, believing the matter settled, the land secured, the debt of her mother's grief repaid in the only currency that had ever seemed to matter to men like the Duke, which was fact, plainly stated and impossible to argue with. And she did not expect to see him again beyond whatever chilly correspondence his solicitor might require to formalize the boundary lines. She was wrong, though it took the better part of a fortnight for her to understand how wrong, because the following week brought a second visit from Higgins, this time bearing not a complaint, but an invitation, awkwardly phrased and clearly not of the steward's own composition. Requesting Miss Vane's assistance in reviewing the estate's drainage records for the whole of the lower valley, as it had come to his Grace's attention that the parcel she had reclaimed was not the only ground on the estate suffering from decades of inattentive management. She read the note twice, turning it over as though it might reveal on a second pass some hidden insult she had missed on the first, but there was none to be found, only a plain request, formally worded, offering a fee for her time that was neither insulting nor excessive, but precisely, almost suspiciously. She thought of refusing. She thought, for the better part of an evening, of all the reasons a sensible woman ought to refuse, chief among them being that she had spent 11 months arranging her life around the recovery of 40 acres and had no wish to entangle herself further in the affairs of a man who had, within her own hearing, once called her mother's grief a matter of sentiment unworthy of a mortgage. But the fee was fair, and the work was precisely the sort she had trained a decade to do, and, she told herself, with the particular dishonesty of the perfectly self-possessed, that it would be foolish to refuse good work on principle when the principle in question had already been satisfied by the return of the land itself. She went. The drainage records, when she finally sat with them, spread across a long table in a room considerably warmer than the library had been, told a story that took her the better part of 3 days to fully unravel, a story of decades of small neglect compounding into a slow catastrophe that had never once been deliberate, only careless. The way a man's habitual certainty that all was well becomes, over enough years, its own kind of ruin. He found silted channels that had not been cleared since before the old Duke's death, tenant complaints filed and never answered, a whole lower meadow slowly reverting to marsh for want of a single afternoon's attention that no one in a decade had thought urgent enough to give it. She presented her findings on the 4th day in the same cold library, though someone, she noticed, had thought to light the fire this time, and the Duke listened to her account of his estate's slow drowning with an attention she had not expected from a man she had privately catalogued as arrogant. "You are telling me," he said slowly when she had finished, "that I have been losing rent on the lower valley for the better part of 10 years, and no one thought to mention it." "I am telling you that your steward mentioned it a great many times," Eleanor said, "and that no one above him thought the mentioning worth acting upon. Higgins is not incompetent, Your Grace. He is merely tired of being ignored." She watched that land, too, the way the Bath deed had landed the week before, watched him absorb the accusation implicit beneath the fact, and find this time that he had no ready defense against it, because there was none to be had, and he said, after a long silence in which the fire cracked and settled, and neither of them moved, to fill the quiet with anything softer, "Then I have been a fool, in rather more particulars than I realized a fortnight ago." "I could not say 'Your Grace,'" she said. "I have known you a fortnight." It was as close to gentleness as she had yet offered him, and she saw him hear it as such, though neither of them remarked upon it, and she gathered her papers and left him to the fire and his own newly uncomfortable arithmetic. The following weeks fell into a rhythm neither of them had precisely designed, but both, if pressed, would have struggled to explain themselves out of. She came twice weekly to review the estate's neglected corners, first the lower valley and then the tenant cottages along the eastern road, and she found, to her private and carefully unexamined surprise, that the Duke had begun to attend these sessions himself, rather than leaving them to Higgins, and that he asked more often than she expected. Questions that were not those of a man merely performing diligence for the sake of appearances, but of a man genuinely trying, perhaps, for the first time in his adult life, to understand what his own land actually required of him, rather than what he had always assumed it owed him. He was not an easy man to like, precisely. He had a habit of stating his opinions as though they were facts already settled beyond dispute, and it took her the better part of a month to realize that this was less arrogance in him than a kind of armor worn so long he had forgotten it could be removed, a way of never having to admit the raw uncertainty beneath a plain declarative sentence. She began, without entirely meaning to enjoy the small skirmishes of contradicting him, watching him receive her corrections, not with the offense she had first expected, but with a flicker of something almost like relief, as though he had been waiting a long while for someone willing to tell him plainly when he was wrong, and had simply never before met anyone with both the standing and the nerve to do it. It was Higgins, in the end, who first said aloud what neither of them had permitted themselves to notice. He caught her in the stable yard one raw November afternoon as she was preparing to ride back to her mother's cottage, and he stood turning his hat in his hands with the particular discomfort of a plain man about to say an indelicate thing to his betters, and said, "Miss Vane, I don't know as it's my place, but His Grace hasn't taken a meal alone in his study since you began coming, not once in 6 weeks, and before that it was his custom every night since his father died." Eleanor felt something in her chest tighten unpleasantly at this, not quite alarm and not quite hope, some unnamed cousin of both. "I imagine His Grace has simply found the estate business more pressing of late, Mr. Higgins." "I imagine he has," Higgins said, with the careful blandness of a man who believes the opposite entirely and has decided not to argue the point further, and he touched his hat and left her standing in the yard, with the cold settling into her hands. She might have let the matter rest there, might have continued the careful professional distance she had maintained since that first cold interview in the library, had it not been for the Michaelmas assembly at the county hall, an event she attended only because her mother, to a kind of social standing that had quietly eroded during the years of the mortgage's shame, wished very much to go, and could not easily go alone. Eleanor had not expected the Duke to be present. He was known by reputation to avoid such gatherings, finding them, as he had once remarked to her with the particular bluntness that no longer surprised her, an elaborate ritual for the exchange of information already known to everyone in the room. But he was present, standing near the long windows, with the stiff discomfort of a man enduring an obligation, and it was there, in the crowded, candlelit hall, that Eleanor first witnessed the public test that would come in later months to feel like the true beginning of everything between them. Lady Cressida Thorne, a woman whose family held land adjoining the Ashcombe estate, and whose interest in the Duke had been for 2 seasons an open secret conducted with all the subtlety of a formal declaration of war, found Eleanor near the refreshment table, and that it was remarkable what company the Duke of Ashcombe had lately been keeping, quite the little land agent he's taken up, playing at business with a woman who sells ditches for a living. It was said with a smile, the particular cruelty of women who have learned to wound within the strict grammar of politeness, and Eleanor felt the old cold stillness rise in her chest. the same stillness she had felt in the estate office a lifetime ago, and she opened her mouth to offer some plain, dignified correction of her own when she found she did not need to, because the Duke's voice cut across the space between them before she had gathered a single word, not raised, never raised, but carrying with the flat, unhurried certainty she had first heard directed against her mother's memory, and now heard, for the first time, turned in her defense instead. "Miss Vane," he said, "has in 6 weeks corrected more of my estate's failures than my own steward and I managed to notice in a decade between us. I would count myself fortunate to keep such company at any price." It was not a declaration. It was characteristically framed entirely as fact, a simple correction of an error in Lady Cressida's understanding of the world, precisely the sort of practical, unadorned defense that a man like him would offer even at the height of feeling. Standing there in the candlelight, with the whole room's attention, briefly and uncomfortably, upon her, that she had just watched him choose her, in the only language he had ever fully trusted, which was the language of plain, indefensible fact. She did not speak to him again that evening beyond the barest courtesies required by the crowded room, but she found, riding home beside her mother beneath a sky gone hard and clear with the first true cold of the season, that something in her had shifted that she could not easily put back into its former place. Some careful wall she had built between the recovery of her mother's land and the ordinary hazards of her own heart, and she spent the following days in a state of private, irritable distraction that she was too honest with herself to call anything but what it was. A mother who had said very little throughout the whole long business of the mortgage and the land and the Duke's slow reformation, chose the evening after the assembly to say a great deal at once, sitting by the fire with her mending forgotten in her lap, and her eyes fixed on her daughter with an expression Eleanor recognized uncomfortably. "You have not asked me," her mother said, "what I think of the Duke of Ashcombe. I did not think it required asking, given the circumstances of our acquaintance with the family." "The old Duke, perhaps not," her mother said. "The son I find myself less certain of. You go very stiff, Eleanor, whenever his name is mentioned, and you have never in your life gone stiff over a man you did not care for one way or another. Indifference does not require armor." Eleanor set down her own needlework rather more sharply than the moment required. "He called this land a matter of sentiment not worth a mortgage, mother. I have not forgotten it, whatever generosity he has since managed to locate." "No," her mother agreed, "nor should you, entirely. But I have lived a good deal longer than you, my girl, and I have learned that a man's worst sentence, spoken in ignorance before he has ever properly looked at a person, is not always the truest thing about him, any more than your coldest morning is. You have spent 11 months teaching that man what the land actually costs. I wonder whether you have noticed you are teaching him, too, what a person actually costs when you trouble to look at them properly." Eleanor had no ready answer for this, which was, she reflected later, answer enough in itself. The private confrontation, when it came, was not of Eleanor's engineering, though she would afterwards suspect that Higgins, in his quiet steward's way, had done rather more to arrange its circumstances than he ever admitted. She had come to Ashcombe House on an ordinary Tuesday to deliver her final accounting of the Eastern cottages, expecting the usual brisk, businesslike hour in the library, and found instead the Duke standing at the window with his back to the door and something in the set of his shoulders that told her, before he had spoken a word, that this would not be an ordinary hour. "I have been thinking," he said without turning, "of the first time you stood in my estate office. Higgins tells me now that you were there before. I ever knew it, that you heard me discuss your mother's land as though it were a debt, without a face attached to it, Eleanor said nothing, only set her papers down upon the desk with the same careful quiet she had used to lay down the Bath deed months before. "I did not know your name," he said. "I did not think it necessary to know it before I disposed of what I believed was mine to dispose of. That is not an excuse. I have gone looking for one these several weeks, and I cannot find it, because there is none to be found. I was wrong about the land, and I was wrong, more importantly, about the manner of woman who might hold a claim to it, and I have spent a decade assuming that certainty was the same thing as competence, and I find now that it was only ever a way of never having to be told." He turned to face her, then, and there was none of the practised remove she had first met in this room, only a rawness that seemed to cost him a great deal to permit her to see. "I am telling you plainly because I do not know any other way to tell you anything, that I was cruel about your mother's grief before I had ever met the woman who carried it, and that I am sorry for it, without excuse or qualification, and that I would very much like the chance to be a better judge of what I do not yet understand. If you would consent to go on teaching me." Eleanor found, standing in the firelit library with the accounting papers forgotten on the desk between them, that the cold stillness she had carried since that first frost-white morning had finally entirely thawed, and that what remained in its place was something far more dangerous to her careful composure. "You called it sentiment," she said quietly, as though grief for a home were a weakness to be managed, rather than a debt of its own kind, owed to the people who built it. "I know," he said. "I have thought of little else since Higgins told me you were standing in the doorway when I said it." "I am afraid of you," she admitted, and it cost her something to say it plainly in his own blunt fashion, though she found, once said, that it was easier than she had expected. "Not of your temper, of how much easier it would be to forgive you than it ought to be." "Then we are both afraid of the same thing," he said, "for I have spent 6 weeks discovering that I would rather be corrected by you than agreed with by anyone else in England, and I do not know what to call that, except the beginning of something I have no practice managing." It was for a man who had spent the whole of their acquaintance speaking in plain declarative certainties, as close to a confession of fear as she had yet heard from him, and she found she believed it far more than she would have believed any grander speech. "My mother says," Eleanor said, after a silence that held rather more in it than either of them attempted to fill with words, "that a man's worst sentence, spoken before he has properly looked at a person, is not always the truest thing about him." "Your mother," the Duke said, "sounds a great deal wiser than her daughter has led me to believe." "My daughter," said Eleanor's mother's voice from the doorway, for she had, in fact, arranged to be present at precisely this hour, a small conspiracy conducted between herself and Higgins that neither of the two people in the library had yet detected, "has never once in her life told me the whole truth about her own heart before it was entirely too late to pretend otherwise. Your Grace, so you will forgive me for coming to see the matter settled with my own eyes." Eleanor turned startled and not a little exasperated to find her mother standing in the doorway with an expression of the purest, most unrepentant satisfaction, and Higgins just visible behind her, suddenly extremely interested in the pattern of the hall carpet. "Mother, I shall say nothing further," her mother said, with the particular firmness of a woman who intends to say a great deal more the moment she is asked, and withdrew, taking Higgins with her, leaving the library once more to the fire, and the two people standing on either side of the desk, with a decade's worth of misjudgment finally, plainly, laid to rest between them. "I ought to tell you," Eleanor said, when the door had closed, "that I did not come to Marlow Fen intending to forgive anyone. I came intending to recover 40 acres, and never once cross your threshold again, if I could manage it. And now?" "Now," she said, I find the boundary rather harder to keep than I expected." "Your Grace Anthony," he said. "My name is Anthony. I have been your grace to you for the better part of 2 months, and I find I would very much rather you called me otherwise, if you are willing." It was, she understood, precisely the threshold her mother had spoken of, the shift from formal distance to something plainer and truer, and she found herself crossing it with far less hesitation than her own careful nature ought to have permitted. "Anthony," she said, and watched something in his face ease entirely, the way a held breath finally releases. And he crossed the small distance of the library between them and took her hand, not with any grand gesture, but with the same plain, practical care he had learned these past 2 months to bring to every account he had once mismanaged, and said, "I do not know how to court a woman who has already outmaneuvered my solicitor, my steward, and my own certainty in a single autumn, Eleanor, so I will only tell you plainly what I know to be true, which is that I would like very much to spend the remainder of my life being corrected by you." "That is not, I think, a proposal any novel would print," Eleanor said, though her voice had gone unsteady in a way she made no effort to disguise. "No," he agreed, "but it is an honest one, and I find I have had rather enough this autumn of the alternative." She did not answer him at once. It was, she told herself later, not hesitation born of doubt, but the same careful instinct that had served her through every mortgage and every ledger she had ever balanced, the instinct that insisted a thing worth having was worth examining fully before it was accepted, and she stood a long moment with her hand still in his, feeling the fire's warmth against one side of her face and his plain, unguarded waiting on the other, before she said, "Ask me again in the spring, when the lower valley has drained properly, and we know whether your reforms have held, and if you are still of the same mind." It was not a refusal, and he understood it as such. The ghost of a smile finally permitted to complete itself on his face for the first time since she had known him. "That," he said, "is precisely the sort of answer I have come to expect from you, and I find I would not have you any other way." The winter that followed was the coldest Marlow Fen had seen in a decade, hard frosts settling deep into the ground and holding through January with a grip that made the older tenants mutter darkly about the coming spring's planting. But Eleanor found, watching the estate's slow recovery from her mother's cottage window, and from the increasingly less businesslike hours she spent in the Ashcombe library, that she did not much mind the cold, because something else in her life had thawed thoroughly enough to make up the difference. She continued her work through the darkest months, reviewing tenant leases and drainage plans with a thoroughness that had nothing left to prove, and everything simply to finish properly, and Anthony continued to attend these sessions himself, no longer from any need to be seen, attending to his own negligence, as he told her plainly one iron-cold evening in December, with the fire burning low and her ledgers spread between them, like the last remaining formality of their whole acquaintance. He had simply come to prefer her company to his own, a fact he stated with the same flat certainty he had once reserved for pronouncements about mortgages and land, though it had, by then, come to mean something entirely different in his mouth. Lady Cressida Thorne, to her credit, did not press her claim a second time. Whatever grace she had been due in the style profiles telling of such rivals arrived quietly in February, when she called upon Eleanor's mother's cottage, unannounced, and sat a stiff quarter-hour over tea before saying that she had spoken unkindly at the Michaelmas assembly and had come to regret it, not least because she had since watched the Duke conduct himself in the small daily matters of his own estate with a competence and humility she would not have credited him with a year before, and she supposed, she said, Unhappy honesty of a woman relinquishing a hope she had held rather longer than was comfortable. That credit for the change belonged somewhere she had been unwilling to look. Eleanor, who had expected triumph and found instead only a kind of tired grace, offered her more tea and no comment at all beyond a plain thank you, which seemed in the end to be the correct response, for Lady Cressida left rather easier in her mind than she had arrived, and the two women were not friends thereafter. Precisely. But were no longer enemies either, which Eleanor privately thought was as much as either of them had any right to expect from the whole uncomfortable business. It was Anthony's ward, his late brother's daughter Marianne, a sharp-eyed girl of 11 who had spent the whole autumn watching the adults around her with the particular unblinking attention of a child too clever to be managed by evasion, who first said aloud. She cornered Eleanor in the estate's small walled garden, where the first snowdrops had begun to push up through ground still hard with the last of the frost, and said, without any preamble at all, "Uncle Anthony has stopped shouting at his correspondence since Christmas, and Higgins says it's on account of you. And I should like to know if you mean to marry him, because if you do, I should like a say in it, as I am the only person in this house who actually likes you both equally." Eleanor, startled into an honesty she had not offered even to her own mother, knelt in the cold garden path to bring herself level with the girl's serious face, and said, "I have asked him to wait until spring to see whether his good sense holds past the winter." "It will hold," Marianne said, with the flat certainty of a child who has decided a matter and does not expect to be argued with an inheritance. Eleanor thought with some amusement, clearly passed down whole from her uncle. "He has been reading your notes on the drainage twice over, and he never used to read anything twice unless it was important." "That," Eleanor said gravely, "is very possibly the most convincing evidence anyone has yet offered me." And Marianne looked so satisfied with herself that Eleanor found she had, without quite intending it, gained a fierce and permanent ally in the small, sharp-eyed girl who noticed everything the adults around her tried politely to hide. The lower valley drained properly that spring, for the first time in a decade, the meadow that had spent 10 years, slowly reverting to marsh, emerging instead green and firm underfoot by the middle of April, and Eleanor walked its restored breadth with Anthony on a morning when the last of the frost had finally entirely given way, the hedgerows along the boundary breaking into leaf, and the light lying gold and low across ground that had, for the whole span of their acquaintance, been the measure of whether his reform of himself would hold past the difficulty of a single autumn's good intentions. "You said you would give me your answer in the spring," he said, "if the valley drained and my reforms held." "I find myself standing in rather firm ground, Eleanor, and I confess I have been counting the days since February with a great deal less dignity than I would like to admit." Eleanor looked out over the restored meadow, green and quiet in the early light, and thought of the frost-white morning nearly a year before, when she had stood in the doorway of the estate office and heard her mother's grief reduced to a matter of unanswered sentiment, and she thought of how far the distance had been between that morning and this one, measured not in months, but in the slow accumulation of small corrected things, ditches cleared and leases renewed, and a man's whole habitual certainty gently, patiently retort. "The valley has drained," she agreed. "And I find, Anthony, that I have rather come to prefer firm ground myself. Is that your answer?" "It is the beginning of one," she said, and there was, in the way she said it, no longer any careful reserve left to guard, only the plain, unhesitating truth of a woman who had spent a decade learning to trust nothing but demonstrated fact, and had finally, in this one particular man, found a fact she no longer wished to argue against. "Yes, Anthony, I will marry you." He did not make a speech of it. It was not, she reflected afterward, in his nature to do so, and she would not have wanted one from him even had he offered it, for the whole of their courtship had been conducted in the plain, practical language of ledgers and boundaries, and honestly stated fault, that his happiness expressed itself the same way in the simple, unadorned fact of his hand closing over hers in the new spring light, and the quiet, unhurried certainty in his voice when he said, "Only, then I am the most fortunate man in the county, and I intend to spend the whole of my life proving I have learned to deserve it." They were married in June in the small stone church at Marlow Fen rather than the grander chapel on the Ashcombe estate, a choice that was entirely Eleanor's and entirely unquestioned by Anthony, who had by then learned thoroughly and for good that her judgment on matters of what was owed to a place and the people who had built it was not to be argued with. And her mother sat in the front pew with an expression of such fierce, quiet triumph that the vicar himself remarked afterward he had rarely seen a mother look so thoroughly vindicated at her own daughter's wedding. Marianne, permitted at her own considerable insistence to serve as the sole attendant, informed anyone who would listen throughout the whole ceremony that she had known how the matter would end since March, and that she considered the credit for the match owed, at least in some small part, to herself, a claim Eleanor did not trouble to dispute. In fact, entirely without merit, the years that followed settled the way. Well-drained ground settles, firm and quiet and productive in ways that made the earlier hardness of the soil difficult, in time, to fully recall. Eleanor did not abandon her work upon her marriage, a fact that scandalized precisely no one who had troubled to know her, and scandalized a great many who had not, and the Ashcombe estate became known within a decade as the best managed land in the county. Its accounts kept with a thoroughness that visiting agents from neighboring estates came with increasing frequency to study and imitate. Higgins remained steward until his retirement, and was fond, in his later years, of telling anyone patient enough to listen that he had known which way the wind was blowing from the very first week Miss Vane began coming twice weekly to review the drainage records, and that he had taken the considerable liberty that final Tuesday in the library, one of ensuring both mother and steward were conveniently positioned to witness whatever might occur, a small conspiracy he confessed to with no shame whatsoever and considerable pride. The fen land itself, the 40 acres that had begun the whole long business, was never sold or folded formally into the Ashcombe estate, but was maintained instead, at Eleanor's particular insistence, as her mother's own property until the elder Mrs. Bourne. Vane's death many years later, at which point it passed, by her own wish, not to the estate at all, but to Marianne, who had by then grown into a young woman, every bit as sharp-eyed and plainly spoken as the girl who had once cornered Eleanor in a walled garden to demand her intentions, and who took up the management of the small parcel with an evident satisfaction that suggested the family's peculiar gift for balancing ledgers and stubborn hearts alike had settled itself firmly into a third generation. On the anniversary of their marriage each June, Anthony and Eleanor walked the boundary of the lower valley together, a small private custom neither of them had ever formally named, but both of them kept without fail, tracing the line of the old drainage ditch, something closer to a private landmark of everything that had passed between them since, and it was there, on the 10th such anniversary, with their own eldest daughter running ahead of them through grass grown thick and green over ground that had once been marsh, that Anthony remarked, with the same flat, done hurried certainty he had once reserved for pronouncements about mortgages and unworthy sentiment, that he did not believe a man could be called wise until he had been thoroughly usefully corrected by someone with the patience to do it properly, and that he counted himself, whatever else might be said of him in the county's slower memory, the most thoroughly corrected man in England, and, the most grateful for it. Eleanor, watching their daughter crouch at the ditch's edge to examine some small treasure in the grass, with the same serious, unblinking attention Marianne had once turned upon the adults around her, said only that she had always found well-drained ground the surest measure of a thing properly tended, land and man alike, and that she had never once, in 10 years, regretted the patience it had cost her to wait for the spring to prove it. The lamp in the estate house window was already lit against the coming evening as they turned back toward home, small and steady across the darkening fields, the same window from which, a decade before, a man convinced of his own unquestionable certainty had once looked out over land he believed entirely his to dispose of, and found in time that the truest thing he owned was not the ground beneath his feet, but the plain, unhurried patience of the woman who had taught him, ledger by ledger and season by season, exactly what it cost to be worth keeping.